Every prophecy begins the same way, with someone absolutely convinced that the universe left them a voicemail. And so, under the soft groan of old wood and the suspicious flutter of a bat pretending to be an angel, we begin tonight's pilgrimage into the medieval mind, a place where the world was always on the edge of ending, and monks sharpened their quills not to write salvation, but to prepare for the apocalypse they were certain was scheduled for next Thursday. You breathe in, a slow, candle-warm breath, and the air tastes like dust wearing a robe. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, the night exhales. Inside, the silence hunches like an old librarian listening for forbidden thoughts. You're here, in this dim cathedral of insomnia, because you want to know why medieval monks were so profoundly, passionately, almost romantically obsessed with the apocalypse. Or perhaps because you simply couldn't sleep. Or because the title whispered to you in that tempting voice that says, yes, feed your brain strange knowledge at 2 a.m. You deserve it. But let us begin with a simple, existential question. The kind scholars with too much time and not enough therapy often asked, if the end of the world didn't happen today, does that mean humanity was granted mercy? Or did God just hit snooze again? The monks, dear listener, believed God had a very busy schedule. Heavenly administration, after all, is not for the faint of heart. Someone has to manage souls, update the book of life, and send seasonal plagues as reminders to stay humble. Naturally, there were delays, yet these monks were determined, furiously so, to decode the divine calendar. They stared at stars, at scriptures, at sheep with oddly shaped birthmarks. They fasted until they hallucinated metaphors. They tracked eclipses as if each one were a passive-aggressive post-it note from heaven. And always, always, they concluded, ah, yes, the end is near, definitely near, practically tomorrow. In fact, I should start packing. But tonight, in our shadowy little sanctuary, we're not here to mock faith. No, we're here to gently roast the universal human habit of taking cosmic uncertainty and turning it into a hobby, because nothing is more human than trying to impose order on chaos. Except, perhaps, insisting we understand God's intentions better than God does. Sit with that thought. Let it settle on your skin like the faint smoke of incense. Feel the irony curl around you like a warm, sarcastic blanket. Tonight's story is a pilgrimage through paranoia, devotion, superstition, poetry, and the quiet, echoing corridors of human doubt. Picture the room around you fading. Picture stone walls rising, cold and damp. A thin candle quivers like a nervous soul. And somewhere, a quill scratches on parchment. A medieval monk writing furiously into the night, convinced that every sound is either divine inspiration or the devil knocking because he forgot his house key. Before you join him, before you walk into his world of trembling faith and exquisitely dramatic expectations, there is one tiny ritual to observe, a modern ritual, a digital sacrament, if you will. Before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing, like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. Now, shh. The candle is listening. The wind is shifting. And somewhere, in the far corner of the monastery, the bells tremble, not because the world is ending, but because the monk in charge of them fell asleep again. Still, it is a fitting mood, a world on the brink, a mind on the brink, a candle always one breath from darkness. Welcome to the beginning. Welcome to the end. Welcome to religious night stories where belief bends like melted wax, and irony drips like holy water with a questionable aftertaste. Tonight, you will learn why medieval monks were so obsessed with the apocalypse, but more importantly, you will wander through the labyrinth of their fears, their hopes, their brilliantly overactive imaginations. You will walk with the monk, our soon-to-be protagonist, through corridors that echo like unanswered prayers, past frescoes so faded they look like divine Picasso experiments, and into the trembling center of his spiritual certainty and uncertainty, and every poetic contradiction in between. But first, let me take you deeper into the medieval night, where every sound felt significant, every shadow felt prophetic, and every sneeze was either a demon passing by or the earliest sign of divine plague. The moon hangs low, suspiciously low, the kind of low that would make a medieval astronomer nervously whisper to his colleague, "Do you think this is an omen?" And his colleague, chewing on stale bread, "Everything is an omen if you're dramatic enough." Our monk, hunched over his vellum, believes exactly that. Every flicker of light, every tremor of the wind, every creak of the building, all signs pointing to the end. He believes it the way people today believe their horoscope or one more YouTube video before bed. But why? Why the apocalypse? Why not visions of prosperity or a future filled with garlic-seasoned optimism? Ah, because the apocalypse is comforting, in a dark, morbidly poetic way. To believe the world will end soon is, ironically, a kind of hope. Hope that one won't have to finish all their earthly responsibilities. Hope that cosmic justice is on its way, even if slightly delayed by celestial traffic. Hope that everything, absolutely everything, will finally make sense. And monks were the original connoisseurs of cosmic meaning. Here, in this twilight monastery of echoing sandals and enthusiastic penmanship, the apocalypse became the medieval equivalent of binge-watching a true crime series. Terrifying, but irresistible. Our monk dips his quill again. Ink glistens like midnight. Thoughts. He writes, "In the year of our Lord, this night felt heavy, as though the sky were contemplating its contractual obligations. Poetic, yes. Accurate? Questionable. But this is exactly why we're here. The medieval mind was a theater, vast, echoing, lit only by firelight and the occasional hallucination from poor nutrition. And in that theater, the apocalypse was the star performer. So breathe slowly. Listen to the soft scrape of quill on parchment. Feel the distant chill of stone. Let yourself slip further into this world of foreboding beauty and comforting dread. Tonight, the end of the world is not a catastrophe. It is a lullaby, a prayer, a cosmic inside joke whispered to you by a storyteller in a candlelit cell where belief and irony sleep under the same blanket. And as this first chapter draws its veil, the monk lifts his head, looks toward the dark window, and wonders, as you might wonder too, if the world is ending, why does it take so long? The candle flickers. The darkness tilts its head. The night swallows the question whole. If you listen carefully, very carefully, you might hear it. The slow, uncertain heartbeat of a medieval monastery at night. Not the dramatic, thunderous kind that Hollywood invents, but a modest, well-meaning thump. The sound of a place that tries very hard to be holy, and succeeds only half the time. Stone walls press inward like solemn witnesses. Moisture clings to them like unconfessed sins. The corridors wander in crooked lines, as if designed by an architect who never quite recovered from his fear of eternal damnation. And somewhere in this lovely labyrinth of shadows and ambition lives our protagonist, a monk. Though calling him merely a monk is like calling a philosophical crisis a small inconvenience. He is, in many ways, the spiritual equivalent of a half-burnt candle, bright enough to be useful, dim enough to question its own purpose. His name, for now, is Brother Aurelius, not because he earned such a poetic name, but because medieval parents were fond of dramatic symbolism. Also because his original name, Bernulf, sounded too much like a man destined to die in a goat-related accident. Brother Aurelius lives in the monastery of St. Dismas the Rather Confused, an institution perched on a hill that constantly forgets it is not, in fact, the center of the universe. The monastery smells of exactly 3 things: old books, older secrets, and bread that has given up on softness. By day, the monks wander its cloisters with the slow dignity of men pretending to understand Latin. By night, the monastery transforms entirely. The air thickens, silence gains weight, candles twitch nervously, as if aware that darkness has seniority here. It is during these sacred nights, the kind where shadows lean in to eavesdrop, that Brother Aurelius feels most alive, and also most uncertain, which, as you will learn, is his natural state. Every morning, Brother Aurelius awakens not to the soft whisper of dawn, but to the clang of the monastery bell, a bell so enthusiastic it rings as though the angel of judgment moonlights as a blacksmith. He rolls from his straw mattress, muttering a prayer that is less glory to God and more, "Give me strength not to strangle the bell-ringer." Then he shuffles through the corridor with the gait of a man who has seen too many theological debates and not enough breakfast. He prays. He chants. He copies manuscripts until his hand feels like a divine punishment. Some mornings, he recites psalms with great devotion. Other mornings, he recites them out of sheer habit, the way you or I might recite the Wi-Fi password without remembering learning it. Every monk around him gives the impression of unwavering piety, standing tall, eyes lifted, voices reverent. But Aurelius prays with the weary intensity of someone who suspects God may not be awake yet. And this contrast, dear listener, is his first great contradiction. He believes, and he doubts. Sometimes simultaneously, a remarkable skill that scholars today call multitasking. But make no mistake, Aurelius does not lack devotion. He simply lacks certainty, which ironically makes him the most sincere monk in the building. The monastery chapel is his favorite place, not for its beauty, though beauty it has in a humble, built by sleep-deprived craftsmen way, but because it is the only place where silence feels intentional. The air inside smells of incense and unresolved theological arguments. Candles line the altar, trembling like introverts at a public gathering. Dust floats in the sunbeams in such dramatic quantities that Aurelius often wonders if the dust itself is trying to ascend to heaven. At dusk, when the shadows stretch like tired pilgrims and the chanting rises from the cloister, the chapel becomes alive with whispered mysteries. But Aurelius always notices something others ignore. For every voice raised in prayer, another voice, quieter, somewhere deeper, is raised in uncertainty. He finds that honest, comforting even, and yet he cannot help but sense that beneath all the solemnity and ritual, something unspoken pulses through the monastery like a secret heartbeat. Fear. A subtle, ever-present, incense-scented fear of the end. For reasons scholars still debate, though Aurelius suspects boredom plays a major role, this monastery is particularly obsessed with the apocalypse. Every monk has his preferred theory. Brother Ignatius, for example, believes the world will end in fire. He says this with such enthusiasm that one suspects he may personally be collecting kindling. Brother Matthias is certain the end will come with signs in the sky, eclipses, comets, clouds shaped like disapproving bishops. Brother Wilfrid, who has consumed the most dubious mushrooms, insists that the world already ended last winter, but no one noticed because it was snowing. But Aurelius listens to these theories with the same resigned skepticism that modern people reserve for online conspiracy videos. He wonders, if the world is always about to end, how does one ever manage to start anything? Yet he does not judge them, not openly at least. Because he understands the quiet truth beneath their prophecies, the apocalypse is comforting, simple, a grand, divine finale where everything finally makes sense. And let us be honest, who among us hasn't looked at the chaos of the world and thought, honestly, maybe ending it all would be more organized? Aurelius's faith is not a blazing fire. It is a small, stubborn ember, warm, persistent, sometimes hidden under doubt. He prays each morning, not out of radiant conviction, but because prayer gives shape to the silence. He copies scriptures, not because he fully understands them, but because copying them keeps him from thinking too much. He chants with the community, not because he agrees with every word, but because chanting sounds better than the gnawing noise inside his own mind. He believes in God, the same way he believes the monastery soup contains vegetables, meaning he hopes so, but the evidence is often unclear. Every evening, after the final bell, Aurelius walks the cloister alone. His sandals whisper over stone. The night swallows his breath, and he begins his nightly ritual, a deep, contemplative sigh, another sigh, followed by a sigh so profound it could be categorized as a minor theological statement. Then he talks to God in the way only a tired monk can. Lord, I seek clarity, or a sign, or, anything. A nudge, a hint, a strongly worded celestial memo? Silence answers him. The deep cosmic silence of a universe that either has nothing to say or is screening its messages. Aurelius nods. He understands. Divine mystery is a powerful spiritual tool, very efficient, doubles as plausible deniability. He returns to his cell with a warmth in his heart that is either genuine faith or indigestion from the monastery stew. His room is simple. A small window, a wooden cross, a bed that looks like it was built during a sermon about suffering, and dozens of scrolls, books, and half-finished pages scattered in what a generous person might call organized chaos. Aurelius swears he does not hoard manuscripts. He merely collects them for study and reflection. And because part of him suspects the end of the world will require footnotes. In this cell, this intimate little universe of ink and doubt, Aurelius feels both closest to truth and furthest from certainty. Some nights he sits at his desk, quill in hand, and writes beautiful reflections. Other nights he falls asleep mid-sentence and wakes up with ink on his face like a holy raccoon. But always his thoughts return to the same quiet, trembling question. Why does everyone around him seem so sure the end is near, while he can barely be sure of his own prayers? This particular night, the air is heavy, the kind of heavy that implies the sky is thinking very hard. Clouds drift like confused ghosts. The moon hides behind them, peeking occasionally in the manner of a noblewoman who enjoys drama. The other monks have gone to sleep, leaving behind a trail of snores that echo like dying bagpipes. But Aurelius is still awake, sitting at his desk, ink glistening, candle trembling, mind wandering like a sheep without adult supervision. He dips his quill and writes, "If the world is ending soon, I should like to know. Mostly so I can stop worrying about next week's chores." He pauses, smiles, not because it's humorous, though it is, but because it feels true. Then he looks around his cell, listening to the restless silence, and feels something stir inside him. Not fear, not prophecy, not divine inspiration, but a subtle, growing ripple of curiosity. A sense that something, somewhere, is shifting. A door opening in the dark. He cannot name it, but he feels it, in his bones, in the candlelight, in the tremor of the distant wind. The world, it seems, is whispering something, calling him, inviting him into a story much larger and stranger than he expected. And he, poor soul, has no idea that this night, this quiet, humble night, is the beginning of a journey that will unravel everything he believes. But before the unraveling, before the doubt, the visions, the absurdity, the crisis, you must know him as he is now. A monk with earnest eyes, ink-stained fingers, a heart full of contradictions, a mind full of questions he is too polite to ask aloud, and a spiritual life built on equal parts devotion and delightful confusion. This is the world he lives in. This is the man he is. Aurelius, monk, dreamer, skeptic, believer by habit, philosopher by accident. And the night, oh, the night, is about to reshape him. Before Brother Aurelius ever tasted the bitterness of doubt, before the celestial silences, the curious dreams, the prophetic shadows, the crumbling foundations of everything he believed, there was a time when his faith rested quietly inside him, like an old cat sleeping by the fire. Not intense, not miraculous, simply present, warm, familiar, a spiritual companion more than a conviction. He didn't come to the monastery out of blazing devotion or divine command. There was no dramatic illumination, no heavenly visitor, no miracle involving livestock. He arrived because the world outside felt painfully loud, and the world inside, this monastery of slow bells and slower monks, offered a silence that promised to hold him without asking too much. His faith back then resembled a lantern held by tired hands. The light flickered often, but he kept walking anyway. He trusted God the way one trusts a distant city one has never visited. You've seen it on the map. Everyone insists it's real, and doubting it feels unnecessary and slightly rude. In those early years, Aurelius believed in miracles the way people today believe in supermarket discounts, with hope, suspicion, and a quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, was exaggerating the details. Still, he cherished the stories, statues that cried, saints who glowed, shepherds who saw angels while tending their sheep, or tending something stronger, depending on who told the story. He listened to it all with the polite half-smile of a man who wants to believe, but keeps noticing the small print. And yet, despite the irony humming at the edges of his mind, he experienced moments of real spiritual tenderness, moments that warmed him unexpectedly, a hush in the chapel so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing, the choir rising in perfect harmony, making his chest vibrate as though another heart had been placed inside him. A morning sunbeam illuminating a dusty psalter in such a way that even dust looked holy. He would close his eyes then, letting the sensation rest against his soul like a soft hand. Maybe this was God. Maybe it was beauty. Maybe he was just tired. He never knew. And that uncertainty somehow made it sweeter. But Aurelius had a troublesome curiosity, the kind that blooms in quiet hearts. He began reading philosophy, mostly the scrolls the monastery preferred not to advertise. Words about existence, meaning, the absurd habit of humans trying to understand the divine. He read them all, slowly, secretly. Some nights he felt his mind expand. Other nights it folded in on itself like damp parchment. As the years passed, he began to realize a truth he wished he hadn't noticed. Every monk around him believed for reasons that had nothing to do with him. One believed out of fear, another out of habit, another because believing made life simpler than thinking. But Aurelius, he didn't know why he believed, and the fact that he didn't know began to quietly unsettle him. Still, he clung to the rituals, the incense that curled upward like questions without answers, the candlelight trembling as if afraid of the dark it was supposed to conquer, the sound of sandals whispering along stone corridors. He clung to all of it the way one clings to fading warmth on a cold night. Rituals made belief feel tangible. Faith, after all, is difficult to touch. Incense, at least, is real. Yet even in the midst of devotion, small misalignments began to trouble him, little shifts in the fabric of his belief. During prayer, he found himself more moved by the wind in the rafters than by the words he recited. During confession, he wondered if sin was less about action and more about hunger. Hungers unsatisfied, misunderstood or misdirected. During sermons, he sensed that the monks preached with confidence, not because they were certain, but because certainty was expected of them. His mind, unfortunately for his peace, was built like a web, catching every contradiction, every irony, every slight tremor in the foundations of belief. And he began to observe something uncomfortable. Faith was rarely perfect. More often it was patched, stitched, reinforced with the spiritual equivalent of duct tape. But Aurelius didn't reject faith. Quite the opposite. He loved faith. But he loved it the way one loves a fragile thing, carefully, delicately, afraid of leaning on it too hard, afraid of discovering that its strength had been overestimated. Hope became his quiet refuge. Not faith, hope. Hope that his prayers mattered. Hope that the universe wasn't ignoring him. Hope that meaning wasn't a rumor humanity told itself out of fear of the dark. Hope is tender. Hope is beautiful. Hope is exhausting, because hope must be carried, and the roads of the Spirit are long. Still, there were weeks, glorious, golden weeks, when Aurelius felt something close to peace. He prayed with a soft confidence. He sang with a heart that felt full. He saw divine fingerprints in the rhythms of ordinary life, the crackle of a candle wick, the warmth of a shared loaf of bread, the silence between two notes of chant. He thought, foolishly, that this peace was a sign of spiritual maturity, that he was finally settling into the gentle arms of certainty. He didn't know, he couldn't know, that these peaceful weeks were simply the last warm breath before winter, the final glow of the candle before the wick bent and drowned in its own wax. Looking back, he would later recognize the warnings, the raven that stared at him with unsettling intelligence, the dream of a locked door he couldn't open, the sermon that felt recycled from another sermon, until meaning thinned like watered wine. The way the sky seemed heavier recently, as though the heavens were leaning closer to hear his thoughts. But Aurelius ignored everything, because ignoring is easier than unraveling, and unraveling leads to change, and change leads to truths we are not always ready to hold. So he prayed that night, the last night he would ever pray without hesitation, with quiet sincerity, unaware that the first tremor of doubt was already moving beneath him. He thought his faith was stable. He thought his soul was anchored. He thought he knew where he stood with God. He did not know that doubt had already placed its hand on his shoulder, gently, politely, almost lovingly. He was a man on the edge of a revelation he had not asked for, and everything, absolutely everything, was about to begin unraveling. There are nights that begin like any other, quiet, obedient, ordinary, only to end by carving a crack across a man's soul. This night began just like that, respectful, still, pretending to be harmless. Brother Aurelius sat alone in his cell, the candle trembling like a nervous witness. He had been copying a passage of scripture, though the words were beginning to blur together into something suspiciously resembling poetry. He rubbed his eyes, blinked twice, and told himself that exhaustion was not a sin, though several monks would have disagreed. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden shutters with the persistence of a beggar asking for theological clarification. The night was heavy, too heavy, perhaps, like someone had draped a velvet curtain over the sky and forgotten to remove it. Aurelius felt pressure in the air, the kind that suggests the universe is leaning in, listening too closely. He inhaled the scent of ink, the faint musk of old parchment, a distant echo of incense seeping through the corridor like a memory that refuses to retire. Then it happened. The knock, soft, measured, polite, in a way that made it even more unsettling. One knock, then two, then silence thick enough to press against the ribs. Aurelius froze. No monk ever knocked at this hour. The brothers moved through the night like wandering shadows, quiet, unobtrusive, the opposite of knocking. Knocking implied urgency, or intention, or worse, a visitor of ambiguous origin. For a moment, Aurelius wondered if perhaps God had finally decided to send him a sign in the form of divine door etiquette. Ridiculous, of course. If God wanted to send a message, he would choose a more efficient method, like a vision or a plague or a pigeon, with unusually articulate cooing. Still, the knock lingered in his bones. He stood slowly, every movement a whisper. His hand moved toward the door as though guided by a string pulled from the other side. He opened it and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just the dark corridor stretching out like a throat swallowing secrets, not a soul, not a breeze, not even the guilty shuffle of a monk playing a prank. Aurelius frowned. Not a dramatic, theatrical frown, just a small, precise wrinkle of confusion, the kind a man gets when he keeps receiving spiritual nudges without a return address. He stepped back, closed the door, and sat at his desk again. He had barely dipped his quill into the ink when he heard it. A whisper. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like the memory of a voice. A breath shaped like a syllable. A sound that did not belong to the corridor, or to his mind, or to anything that respected the laws of life and sanity. It said nothing comprehensible, and yet he understood it perfectly. It said, "Listen." Aurelius froze again, halfway between prayer and panic. He looked around the cell as if expecting a shadow to greet him formally. Nothing. Just the candle flickering, performing its usual drama. The whisper did not return, which, in a way, made it worse. He swallowed, his throat dry. Perhaps, he told himself, I am tired. This was a reasonable explanation. Reasonable explanations are comforting. They feel like warm blankets stitched from denial. But the whisper hovered in the room's silence like an aftertaste. He closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips to his temples. This was manageable. This was fine. People hallucinated all the time. Well, not all the time, exactly, usually after long fasts, poor diets, or when attempting to interpret the book of Revelation too late at night. Then came the second sign. Absurd, subtle, impossible to ignore. It was the candle. Its flame stretched upward, not flickered, not wavered, but reached, like a thin golden finger pointing toward the ceiling, as though something had breathed beneath it. Aurelius leaned closer. The flame continued rising, elongating unnaturally, defying logic, defying wax, defying theology. He felt something cold crawl up his spine. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. He whispered, "If this is a sign, please be gentle." The flame snapped back to normal. Aurelius sat there staring, not breathing, not thinking, just absorbing the absurdity of life, the absurdity of faith, the absurdity of candles that behave like prophets. He tried to continue writing, but the ink felt heavier now, as if infused with cosmic tension. A crack had opened, tiny but real. He felt it. It wasn't fear of demons or angels or divine reprimand. It was the quieter fear, the philosophical fear, the one that whispers, "What if my understanding of reality is slightly incorrect?" He leaned back in his chair, allowing the room to blur. The air smelled different now, less of parchment, more of something metallic and ancient, like rusted bells or forgotten prayers. He tried to rationalize. Monks are good at rationalizing. Perhaps the knock came from the wind. Perhaps the whisper came from his own thoughts. Perhaps the candle flame reacted to a draft. Yes, drafts could do that. Drafts were known culprits. Drafts had been blamed for spiritual phenomena for centuries, but drafts do not knock. Drafts do not whisper in syllables. Drafts do not know your name even when they pretend not to speak it. He inhaled again, trying to calm the tremble in his chest. Then, like the universe truly wanted to mock him, the third sign arrived. The parchment he had been copying shifted, not dramatically, not levitating, not glowing. It simply slid, a small, soft movement, as if nudged by an invisible fingertip, as if the words themselves had grown restless. Aurelius blinked, leaned in, watched it. Nothing, absolutely nothing. But that tiny movement, that whisper soft slide, did something to him, something irreversible. It wasn't the action itself that unsettled him. It was the fact that his first thought was not, "This must be explained," but rather, "What does it mean?" That shift, from reason to interpretation, from logic to symbolism, from reality to possibility, that was the true seed of doubt. Not distrust of God, but distrust of his own understanding. Aurelius placed a hand on his chest. His heart beat faster, like a monk late for morning prayer. He whispered into the stillness, "If you are trying to tell me something, I am listening. I think." The candle flickered gently, as if amused. And suddenly, Aurelius felt a strange, impossible sensation, not warmth, not cold, more like a presence leaning over his shoulder, not threatening, not comforting, simply aware. He stayed motionless, breathing slowly, eyes fixed on the candlelight. He whispered again, tightening his fingers around the edge of his desk, "Please don't let this be madness." Ah, but doubt is a polite visitor. It never enters loudly. It takes off its shoes, steps inside softly, and sits quietly where you can barely see it. You don't notice its presence until you trip over it in the dark. Aurelius didn't know it yet, but tonight, doubt had taken a seat in his soul. A small seat, a humble seat, but a permanent one. He blew out the candle. The darkness swallowed the room like an old friend with questionable intentions. He lay down, eyes open, mind racing, Every sound now felt symbolic, every shadow a possibility, every breath a sign, and the whisper, that single, fragile, impossible whisper, echoed inside him. Listen. He did listen. He listened all night. He listened until the darkness felt louder than daylight, until silence became a sermon. When dawn finally arrived, Brother Aurelius rose with the quiet conviction of a man who knows his world has shifted, but does not yet understand how. He believed he had experienced something spiritual, or psychological, or supernatural, or perhaps he had simply inhaled too much candle smoke. But whichever it was, the seed was planted, and seeds grow, even when you wish they wouldn't. The morning after, the whisper felt wrong from the very beginning. Not dramatically wrong. Not the sky is falling wrong. Just subtly misaligned. Like a painting that hangs 2 centimeters off center and ruins an entire room without anyone knowing why. Brother Aurelius woke before the bell, a rare event, considering the bell usually woke even the saints carved into the stone walls. He lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams that suddenly felt farther away, as though the room had expanded slightly overnight. For a moment, he wondered if he was still dreaming. But dreams rarely feel this humid. He rose, dressed, and stepped into the corridor. The monastery smelled different today. Usually it smelled like old stone, dust, and the faint aroma of bread silently begging for redemption. But today, it smelled like wet earth after rain, even though the sky outside was perfectly dry. Aurelius frowned. This was the first sign that something in him had shifted. A few days ago, he would have ignored such a detail. Today, it felt like a message, as though someone had scented the air with a metaphor only he was supposed to notice. He walked toward morning prayer, sandals whispering across stone. The other monks filed into the chapel with their usual expressions, solemn, sleepy, secretly irritated but pretending to radiate holiness. Brother Ignatius sighed dramatically, as though carrying the weight of the world instead of his aging knees. Brother Godfrey tripped on his own robe again, which was its own quiet form of liturgical comedy. The chanting began. It should have been soothing, comforting, predictable, like spiritual wallpaper. But today, the chanting sounded hollow in a way that made Aurelius wonder whether the chapel had always been built from emptiness, carefully shaped into stone. He looked around. The monks were singing. Their mouths moved. Their voices echoed. But something in the sound felt thin, as if every note carried a question instead of an answer, as if the chant was less a declaration of faith and more an attempt to convince themselves they still had some. He swallowed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He tried to focus on the psalm, on the melody, on the breath moving through him. But instead of prayer, he heard the whisper from the night before, curling through the back of his mind. Listen. He listened. And the listening transformed everything. The shuffle of sandals sounded like retreat. The incense smelled like smokescreen. The candlelight trembled like a lie trying very hard to stay lit. He forced himself to join the chant, but his voice came out softer than usual, like a ghost of itself. Brother Matthias glanced at him suspiciously. Aurelius pretended not to notice. Suspicion was Matthias's default setting. He had long ago concluded that spiritual purity could be measured by one's ability to glare devoutly. After prayer, the monks shuffled off to their daily duties. Some copied manuscripts, some swept floors, some stood around contemplating eternity in ways suspiciously similar to avoiding chores. Aurelius took his place in the scriptorium, The room smelled of ink and devotion. The windows filtered sunlight as if the morning itself were ashamed to shine too brightly on unfinished theological work. He dipped his quill into ink. The tip shook. Slightly. Barely. Like a leaf caught in a breath of wind. He blamed fatigue. He blamed the whisper. He blamed the candle from last night for being overly theatrical. He began copying a passage from the book of Isaiah, a comforting passage, a predictable passage, one he had copied so many times that his hand usually moved on its own. But today, the words felt heavy. He wrote line after line, but each sentence seemed to question him. Do you still believe this? Are you sure? Do these promises still fit the shape of your soul? He tried to ignore it. Humans ignore a lot. It's one of our most underrated talents. He kept writing, but then his quill slipped, a small slip, a tiny streak of ink across the margin, and that was enough. Aurelius froze. He stared at the ink blot. It stared back. It was only ink, only a mistake, only a mark on parchment. But to him, in that moment, it felt like an omen, a small, silent announcement that something inside him had begun to leak. He closed his eyes. He breathed deeply. He wanted to feel faith. Wanted it fiercely. Wanted it with that quiet, aching hunger only the faithful and the starving understand. But nothing came. The silence inside him felt empty, and that emptiness terrified him. He tried again, whispered a prayer under his breath, a small one, a simple one, like a child tapping politely at heaven's door, Lord, help me. But there was no warmth, no whisper, no reassurance, only silence, a cold, patient silence, the kind that suggests either divine mystery or divine voicemail. He lifted his head and looked around the scriptorium. Everything seemed slightly wrong. The candles flickered too slowly. The shadows clung too closely to the floor. The air felt like a held breath. He looked at the other monks. They worked with mechanical devotion, heads bowed, faces calm, hearts unknown. He wondered, suddenly, painfully, whether any of them truly believed, or whether belief was simply another habit. Like waking, eating, or exhaling. Brother Ignatius scratched his nose with holy intensity. Brother Godfrey dropped his quill and muttered something that was either a prayer or an insult. Brother Matthias kept looking at everyone like a hawk, searching for spiritual infractions. Aurelius felt alone. Not physically. He was surrounded by monks who breathed, sneezed, sighed, and coughed with annoying regularity, but spiritually, profoundly. Alone in the kind of way people become alone when they suddenly notice the cracks in the stained glass of their own faith. He tried to shake it off. He reminded himself that spiritual dry spells happen, that doubt is normal, that even saints struggled. He told himself all the comforting things believers tell themselves when the silence of heaven becomes too loud. But the truth was cruelly simple. The whisper from the night before had not left him. It had burrowed into him, settled behind his ribs, wedged itself into the soft space where certainty used to live. He spent the rest of the morning pretending the world had not changed, pretending his soul had not shifted, pretending the whisper had not opened a small doorway to something vast and unsettling. By noon, his hands trembled. By evening, his thoughts tangled. By nightfall, he felt as though he were walking on the thin ice of his own belief, listening for cracks, hearing some, pretending not to hear others. When he returned to his cell, he closed the door quietly, as if fearing he might disturb whatever now lived in the silence. He sat on his bed, hands clasped, head bowed. Not in prayer exactly, more in surrender. He whispered into the stillness, "Please, just give me something. A sign, a feeling, a nudge, anything. But the silence did not break. Aurelius felt something deep inside him tilt, like a table leg giving way under the weight of too many existential questions. He lay back, staring at the ceiling. The darkness felt thicker than usual, heavier, more intentional. He thought of the whisper, the candle flame, the moving parchment. He wondered if he was being visited or warned or slowly losing his mind. He wasn't sure which option terrified him more. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, uneasily, like a child afraid to enter a room that seems too quiet. And as he drifted, just before the final pull of unconsciousness claimed him, he thought he heard it again, soft, distant, delicate as dust settling on stone. Listen. When he woke the next morning, the crisis had already begun. There is a moment in every crisis when the soul stops resisting and simply tilts. Not shatters, not explodes. Those are luxuries reserved for saints and melodramatic prophets. No, for ordinary mortals, for gentle monks with trembling hands and tired faith. The breaking point arrives quietly, like a sigh slipping through a locked door. For Aurelius, the moment came 3 nights after the whisper. It began with a dream, or something that pretended to be a dream. Dreams usually unravel. This one unfolded. He found himself in the monastery courtyard. The moon hung strangely low, swollen like a lantern held by an invisible hand. The stones beneath him glowed faintly, as if remembering something holy they had forgotten to mention for centuries. There were no monks, no bells, no wind, just him, and the silence. The same silence that had been following him like a polite shadow with questionable motives. He walked forward. His sandals made no sound. The stones did not echo. The world had muted itself, like someone had lowered the volume on reality. At the center of the courtyard, the ancient well stood, dark, circular, bottomless, a hole carved into the earth long before the monastery was built, long before prayers were whispered here, long before humans decided to negotiate with eternity. Aurelius felt drawn to it, not physically, emotionally, spiritually, absurdly, the kind of draw one feels toward a forbidden book or a locked door, or an idea one suspects will ruin everything. He approached the well and peered inside. Darkness, absolute, thick velvet darkness. The kind of darkness that doesn't just hide things, it digests them. He leaned closer, and the darkness moved. A breath, a ripple, a shifting like ink disturbed under water. Aurelius jerked back, heart pounding. His mind scrambled for explanations. Wind, illusion, dream logic, premonition, overcooked monastery stew. But none of those fit, because the darkness was now rising, slowly, quietly, in a long trembling column, as if something in the depths had decided to stretch. A shape emerged, not a face, not a body, but an outline, a suggestion of a human form carved from shadow and hesitation. It had no eyes, and yet he felt it watching him. No mouth, and yet he felt it breathing. Aurelius wanted to run, wanted to cry out, wanted to wake up and find himself safely buried beneath blankets and doubt. But his body would not move. It had signed a contract with the unknown without consulting him. The shadow leaned toward him, not threatening, not kind, just curious. Aurelius whispered, barely audible, "What are you?" The shadow flickered. Then a sound reached him, not from the figure, not from the well, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice, a single word, a word shaped from absence and dust. Why? Aurelius staggered back. Not what, not who, not how, but why? Why? Why what? Why him? Why faith? Why existence? Why silence? Why sound? Why doubt? The question burrowed into him like a cold needle. He tried to speak, but the air inside his throat felt thick, heavy, laced with questions he had never dared put into words. Then the shadow dissolved, not vanished, but unraveled, like a tapestry pulled apart by invisible fingers. It collapsed into wisps, slipping back into the depths of the well like smoke returning to fire. The darkness stilled, the courtyard brightened, the world returned its volume, and Aurelius woke, jerking upright, sweating, heart thundering like an untrained drummer. His cell was quiet. Only the soft glow of the dying candle remained, wax pooling like melted time. It was just a dream, just a dream. But dreams do not ask questions like why unless something inside a person has already begun asking it first. Aurelius pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He whispered into the dimness, "Lord, please, I don't understand." The candle flickered. In agreement or mockery, he couldn't tell. He rose, pacing the floor. His thoughts knotted themselves into tangled loops. Was the dream divine? Demonic? Psychological? Symbolic? He hated symbolism. Symbolism always demanded interpretation, and interpretation demanded certainty, something he no longer possessed in reliable amounts. He knelt, trying to pray, trying to anchor himself, trying to anchor anything. But prayer did not come. Only words. Dry words. Words that felt like pebbles tossed into a dry well. He felt naked, small, exposed to something vast and indifferent. The crisis had begun, and like all crises, it refused to stay politely internal. The next day, everything went wrong. Brother Ignatius accused him of looking unusually haunted. Brother Matthias asked if he was fasting, or possibly possessed. Brother Godfrey handed him a bowl of porridge and said sincerely, "You look like you've seen the book of Revelation in real time." Every sound grated on Aurelius. The echo of the bell felt too sharp. The sunlight in the cloister felt too bright. The chanting at midday felt too out of tune. Even though it was perfectly normal chanting, the usual disharmonious harmony of untrained voices trying to impress God, he felt dislodged from reality, as if the world had shifted slightly to the left, and he remained standing in the old alignment. During evening prayer, it happened again. Not the dream, not the shadow, not anything so dramatic. Something much worse. He felt nothing. Not peace, not stirring, not warmth, not even longing, just emptiness. A hollow space inside him where belief once lived. He stared at the crucifix, hands clasped, waiting for some sensation, a spark, a tremor, a flicker of divine reassurance. Nothing. He whispered a prayer. Nothing. He whispered another. Nothing. He waited. Nothing. Silence. The same silence that had whispered, the same silence that had followed him, the same silence that felt too alive to be mere absence. He felt tears gather behind his eyes. Tears born not of sadness, but of spiritual claustrophobia. The moment of breaking came softly. He whispered, voice so small only the dark corners could hear it. "If you are there, why won't you answer?" The silence tightened around him, not cruelly, but like a hand closing gently over a trembling wing. Aurelius felt his last thread of certainty snap. It didn't shatter loudly. It didn't explode in revelation or blasphemy. It broke like a hair breaking between two fingers. Soft, quiet, final. He felt it. The collapse, the internal slipping, the fall into the cold, wide-open space of not knowing. He leaned forward, breath shallow. He whispered again, "Please, say something." But the silence remained, patient, vast, ancient, the kind of silence that does not reply because it does not need to. Aurelius knelt there until his knees ached, until his hands trembled, until his candle burned low. Finally, he rose, slowly, weakly, like a man carrying the weight of invisible stones. He walked back to his cell, closed the door, and sat in the dark. He did not cry, not yet. Instead, he whispered the only truth he could still articulate. I don't understand anything anymore. And for the first time in his life, he realized that not understanding might be the most honest prayer he had ever spoken. When a soul breaks, it doesn't make the dramatic sound you expect. No thunder, no crack, no angel dropping their harp in surprise. It breaks the way parchment tears, quietly, slowly, with fibers giving way one by one. So softly, in fact, that only the one being torn feels it. For Brother Aurelius, the days after his collapse were strangely calm, a terrible calm, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. He woke the next morning feeling hollow, not frightened, not angry, not rebellious, just hollow, like a bell that had forgotten how to ring. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor as dust drifted lazily through a beam of sunlight. He watched the particles float, dance, vanish. Little pieces of the world suspended between meaning and nothingness. He felt strangely jealous of them. Dust never questions its purpose. Dust never asks why. Dust simply exists, quietly, without expectation. He rose slowly. His body felt heavier than usual, as if doubt had weight, as if uncertainty were something a man could carry in his spine. The bell rang, a sharp, metallic reminder that the world continued to move, even when he did not. He walked to morning prayer, his steps slow, almost reluctant. The chapel glowed with early light. Incense curled upward in thin ribbons, trying very hard to pretend it knew where it was going. Candles flickered with the delicate caution of creatures afraid to be extinguished. The monks began to chant. Aurelius listened. The chant washed over him like wind over a broken reed, sound without resonance, words without depth. He tried to join, but his voice felt foreign, like someone had replaced his spirit with an echo. He looked around and saw the monks as he had never seen them before. Not holy, not enlightened, not guardians of truth. Just men, tired, imperfect, squinting at their own faith like craftsmen examining a cracked tool, hoping it still worked. For the first time, Aurelius saw the weariness behind their eyes, the fear behind their devotion, the desperation in their certainty. And he wondered, with a heaviness that settled deep in his chest, have we all been pretending? He bowed his head, feeling the question burn quietly inside him. After prayer, the monks dispersed into their routines, each clinging to the structure of the day like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Aurelius walked to the cloister instead of the scriptorium. He needed air, or silence, or nothing. The cloister garden was still, the grass damp with dew. A few stubborn flowers leaned toward the light, defying the world's indifference with a small, quiet courage. Aurelius sat on a stone bench and exhaled slowly. His breath felt heavy, as though carrying words he could not articulate. For a long while, he simply watched the garden. Every leaf, every shadow, every movement of wind. He didn't look for meaning. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he let the world exist without expecting it to answer him. And in that stillness, he realized he had entered a strange new phase of faith. Not disbelief and not belief, but something in between, a neutral zone, a spiritual borderland, where nothing made sense and nothing was required to. He closed his eyes. The silence pressed against him, not cruelly, not lovingly, just present. A silence thick with everything he no longer knew. He whispered into the air, "Is this all there is?" The wind answered by not answering, and yet there was something comforting about that. A strange peace in the quiet refusal of the world to provide explanations. He was beginning to understand something essential. Sometimes meaning hides itself not to punish, but to teach us how to see. But Aurelius did not feel wise. He felt depleted. He stood, walked slowly toward the fountain in the center of the cloister, and looked at his reflection in the water. It stared back with tired eyes and uncertain faith. He whispered, "I do not recognize you." The reflection, wisely, did not argue. Later, he returned to the scriptorium. The familiar scent of ink greeted him, once comforting, now sharp, almost mocking. He sat at his desk and opened a blank page. Blank, perfect, silent. He dipped his quill into ink. He hesitated, then wrote 2 words, "I'm lost." He stared at them. The ink glistened. The words looked both ridiculous and painfully true. He added, "But I'm listening." His hand trembled. He closed the notebook gently, as though the honesty inside might escape. The rest of the day passed like a dream wrapped in fog. He copied scripture mechanically. His hand moved, but his mind floated somewhere beyond reach. During supper, he barely tasted the stew. Brother Ignatius made a dramatic speech about divine justice in overcooked vegetables. Brother Matthias glared at the bread as if suspecting it of mortal sin. Brother Godfrey almost choked on a bean. Aurelius sat quietly, feeling the weight of being alive press against him. Heavy, quiet, and unignorable. That night, he returned to his cell, closed the door, lit a candle. The flame shivered, and the shadows leaned in like curious listeners. He sat on the bed and whispered, "I don't know what to believe anymore." There was no answer, just the candle breathing slowly in the dark. He lay down, staring at the ceiling. The silence felt infinite. Not empty, not full, just infinite. He thought of God, of doubt, of the shadow in the well, of the word why echoing through the deepest parts of him. He thought of nothing and everything, and the strange, unsettling truth that sometimes the absence of answers can feel strangely restful. He closed his eyes, not in peace, not in despair, just in exhaustion. Somewhere between sleep and waking, a single thought drifted through him, soft as dust, heavy as stone. Perhaps silence is not the absence of God, but the way God waits. He didn't know if the thought was profound or pathetic, or merely the brain's attempt to comfort itself. But it rested in him like a stone placed carefully on an altar. And for the first time since the crisis began, Aurelius did not feel afraid of the silence, only curious, only listening, only waiting. The storm had passed. What remained was the ashes and the quiet, and the strange, trembling possibility that something might grow in the ruins. Revelations never arrive on time. You imagine they will. You picture them descending with trumpets, or bursting through clouds, or materializing beside your bed like an angelful apology for all the cosmic silence. But true revelations, the dangerous kind, the meaningful kind, the kind that bend a life without warning, those always arrive disguised. As hunger, as fatigue, as coincidence, as misinterpreted shadows, as something you are absolutely certain means nothing. Aurelius's revelation began, of course, with bread. Stale bread, the kind of bread that gives you the distinct impression it resents being eaten. The monks had gathered for the evening meal. The hall was dimly lit. the candles struggling heroically against the vastness of the room. Spoons scraped bowls, bread cracked like old bones. Someone coughed a cough that could easily be interpreted as either piety or impending death. Aurelius stared at his portion of bread, turning it in his hands like an object holding secrets he had no patience to interpret. He wasn't hungry. He hadn't been hungry for days. Doubt, apparently, was an appetite suppressant. He broke off a piece anyway, more out of duty than desire, and brought it to his lips. And that was when he saw it, or thought he saw it, or imagined seeing it. The bread moved. Only slightly, barely a shift. A tremor so delicate it could have been the candlelight or his pulse or his mind gently collapsing. But he froze. Monks continued eating around him, chewing, sipping, praying, suffering. No one else noticed, or cared, or breathed differently. Aurelius leaned closer to the bread. The crust glimmered faintly, or perhaps the candle sputtered. It was hard to say. He exhaled softly, and the bread, his bread, tilted. Just a fraction, a tiny, ridiculous fraction. The kind of fraction that should not be significant, yet somehow was. Aurelius felt something loosen in his chest. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even shocked. He was curious. "Are you trying to speak to me?" he whispered under his breath. Brother Ignatius, seated beside him, raised an eyebrow. What was that? "Nothing," Aurelius murmured. "Because how on earth do you explain spiritual communication via carbohydrates?" He stared at the bread again. Nothing happened. No movement, no glimmer, no divine message carved into the crumbs. It sat motionless, innocent, quiet. He wondered if he had imagined it. If his exhaustion had tilted his perception just enough to make the world wobble. If hunger had twisted reality into something symbolic. Or if, and this was the strangest thought, something had genuinely moved. He didn't eat the bread. He set it aside respectfully, as one sets aside a letter without an address. After supper, still unsettled, Aurelius wandered the cloister again. The night was cold, sharper than usual. The moon hung above like a coin God had tossed and forgotten to catch. He walked slowly, his sandals brushing through fallen leaves, his mind strangely empty. For the first time since his crisis began, he felt neither despair nor clarity. Only readiness. A quiet readiness, the kind you feel before opening a door you don't remember closing. He reached the courtyard. The fountain murmured softly, its water reflecting the moonlight like liquid glass. Aurelius approached it. Not because he expected something. He had given up expecting things. Expectations were exhausting. He simply felt pulled, as though his thoughts were on a thread being gently wound by unseen hands. He knelt beside the fountain, touched the water with his fingertips. It was cold. It was real. He whispered, "I'm listening." The night held its breath. Then something happened. A ripple. Just one. Soft. Circular. Impossible. Because nothing had touched the surface. Aurelius stared at the water. The ripple widened, spreading outward, fading into stillness again. He leaned, closer, and saw something impossible. His reflection looked back at him, the same face, the same tired eyes, the same monk unsure of his own prayers. But the reflection smiled. Aurelius did not. He jerked backward, heart pounding. The fountain stilled. The reflection returned to normal. His own expression, confused, frightened, strangely exhilarated, stared back. He rubbed his eyes, looked again. Normal water, normal reflection, normal reality. He breathed hard. "Maybe," he whispered, "this is madness." But madness does not smile at you with your own face in a way that feels neither cruel nor comforting, just aware. He backed away from the fountain, his breath shallow. The night seemed taller suddenly, as if stretching its spine. The shadows seemed to lean inward. The air felt charged with a silence that wasn't empty anymore. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the echo of fear and fascination collide. He whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" No voice answered, but something did. A single leaf fell from a nearby tree, drifting slowly, silently, spiraling through the air like a small, dying planet. It landed at Aurelius's feet. He picked it up. It was warm. Leaves are not warm. Not in cold night air, not in autumn, not in monasteries built from stone and fear. He stared at it. The warmth pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. He felt dizziness wash through him. Was this divine? Psychological, symbolic, coincidental, or simply absurd? He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. Instead, tears filled his eyes, not tears of fear, and not tears of joy, tears of meaning, or the hunger for meaning, or the hunger for being hunger. He returned the leaf gently to the ground as though returning something sacred to its altar. He whispered, "If this is you, I don't understand." The night said nothing, but the silence felt different now, more like presence than absence. He walked back to his cell in a daze, closed the door behind him, sat on the floor. His heart would not settle. He thought of the bread, the ripple, the smile, the leaf, all so small, so subtle, so strange. None of them definitive, none of them absolute. But together they formed a whisper of possibility. Something was reaching toward him, or he toward it. He did not know. He only knew this: it was not nothing. And that was enough to terrify him. He lay down, eyes wide open, the darkness pressing gently against his skin. "Was that you?" he whispered into the void. And in the thick silence, a quiet, almost imperceptible warmth settled in the room like a lingering exhale. He did not know if it was divine presence, or the last flicker of his imagination, or simply the heat from his own body rising into the cold air. He didn't care. For the first time in weeks, he felt something inside him soften. A knot loosening, a wound breathing, a door half opening inside his ribs. The revelation wasn't clear. It wasn't certain. It wasn't even identifiable. It was ambiguous, uncomfortable, unresolved. But it was real. And sometimes the most sacred experiences are the ones we can never explain. There is a strange tenderness in the days that follow an ambiguous revelation, a softness, an ache, a sense of walking barefoot inside your own chest. Brother Aurelius woke the next morning with that peculiar softness clinging to him, as though the night had wrapped him in a blanket woven from unanswered questions. He didn't feel certain. He didn't feel enlightened. He didn't feel rescued. He simply felt awake. And that alone was terrifying. The monastery looked the same as always. The stone walls stoic, the dust patient, the monks wandering like somnambulant ghosts with excellent posture. But Aurelius noticed things he had never noticed before. The sunlight entering through the chapel window didn't just illuminate the altar. It hesitated there, as though deciding whether to stay. Brother Matthias's chanting wasn't merely off-key. It was passionately off-key, as if sung by a man who believed God measured sincerity, not musical ability. Brother Godfrey's habitual clumsiness suddenly seemed almost philosophical, as though each stumble were a reminder that spiritual paths are rarely straight. And the silence that had once oppressed him, now felt like a companion walking a step behind, breathing with him, waiting. Waiting for what he did not know. Perhaps for him to ask. Perhaps for him to accept. Perhaps simply for him to stop trying to decode everything like a divine puzzle. He moved through the day with a strange mixture of dread and clarity. When he copied scripture, the words did not reproach him for his doubt. If anything, they seemed relieved, as though finally being read by someone who wasn't pretending certainty. When he ate, he tasted the bread cautiously, half expecting it to speak, half disappointed when it didn't. When he walked the cloister, he noticed the sound of footsteps, the soft, rhythmic echo that reminded him he was still here, still present, still tethered. Presence was something he had not felt in a long time, and yet beneath that presence flowed an undercurrent of unease. Not fear, not despair, something more subtle, the awareness that his faith had shifted shape, not vanished, not broken, simply changed. He no longer believed in the simple God of childhood prayers, the God who behaved predictably, the God who sent clear signs and cleaner answers. He now stood before a God, or an absence, or a presence, or a mystery, that whispered instead of spoke, appeared in symbols instead of declarations, slipped into the world through ripples, shadows, warm leaves, reflective smiles. A God who may not be the God of the monastery, a God who might not care about the right liturgical posture, or the correct pronunciation of Latin psalms, or bread that occasionally twitched. Aurelius didn't know if that God existed. He didn't know if the contradictions he saw were divine mischief, or psychological collapse or hunger mixed with theology. He didn't know if his doubts were failures or invitations. He only knew this: something had begun. Something had opened. Something had reached across the quiet distance between himself and whatever waited on the other side of understanding. That evening, as the monks gathered for prayer, Aurelius lingered in the shadow of the chapel doorway, watching candlelight tremble over their faces. The chanting rose, soft, wavering, beautiful in its imperfections. He did not join. Instead, he walked outside, toward the garden, toward the fountain, toward the place where the world had once rippled without cause. Night was settling. The stars were just beginning to emerge, like timid eyes peeking from behind the curtain of heaven. Aurelius approached the fountain, knelt, watched the water. It did not ripple. It stayed perfectly still, smooth as glass, reflecting the dim sky and the faint outline of his face. He whispered, "I'm still here." The reflection did not smile this time. It simply watched him, neutral, quiet, honest. He dipped his fingers into the water, cold, sharp, certain. The world felt real again, and unreal, and too real, and not real enough. He closed his eyes, and the silence pressed in, not heavy, not frightening, just present. He whispered, "If this is you, I don't know what you want." The night did not answer, but something small, something gentle, shifted in the wind. A soft rustling of leaves, a subtle change in temperature, a breath of air that brushed past him like a passing spirit that did not intend to stay but wanted to be acknowledged. Aurelius opened his eyes, looked around. Nothing. No figure, no sign, no apparition. Just night. Just wind. Just the world being exactly what it was. Mysterious, quiet, indifferent, alive. He felt tears rise again, not from sorrow, but from that strange ache that appears when meaning is too large to swallow. He whispered into the night, "I'm listening, but I don't understand." A pause, a breath, a stillness so complete it felt deliberate. Then, with the softest, most delicate certainty, he felt something inside him answer, "You don't have to understand. Just that. Nothing more. Nothing less. A truth small enough to miss, large enough to guide a life. Aurelius exhaled shakily. He did not smile, but something inside him loosened, just slightly, like a tightly knotted thread beginning to unwind. He stood slowly, hands trembling, breath unsteady. He turned toward the monastery. The chapel glow flickered through the windows. Voices rose in imperfect harmony. For the first time in weeks, Aurelius did not feel distant from them. He did not feel certain, but he felt connected, in doubt, in longing, in not knowing. He walked back inside, the shadows embracing him like old friends with questionable intentions. As he reached the doorway of the chapel, he paused, hand resting against the wooden frame. He whispered, "Maybe the world isn't ending after all." The wind, that eternally ambiguous messenger, drifted through the cloister in a way that could be interpreted as agreement or coincidence or divine humor. Aurelius breathed in the scent of incense and candle wax and uncertain holiness. He stepped inside and let the shadows close around him. Behind him, the night continued its quiet conversation with itself. Above him, the stars blinked like cosmic bureaucrats who had misplaced their paperwork. Somewhere, a door, spiritual or otherwise, remained ajar. The story did not end. It only shifted. And perhaps, somewhere far above, far below, or far within, a divine presence was avoiding messages, just like everyone else does on Mondays. At the end of all stories, even the quiet ones, even the ambiguous ones, even the ones told in shadows with more questions than answers, there comes a moment when night and silence share a final breath. That is where Brother Aurelius stood now, not wiser, not holier, not certain, just here, a small monk in a large world surrounded by stone walls and cosmic riddles, with a candle in one hand and a trembling soul in the other. He sat alone in his cell. The candle's flame leaned sideways, stretching like a weary pilgrim reaching for rest. Wax dripped slowly, thick, golden tears sliding toward the wooden table, as though time itself were melting in front of him. The room smelled of extinguished incense and old scrolls, with a faint undertone of dust that had witnessed too many prayers and too many disappointments. Aurelius ran his fingers over the spine of a book he had not opened since before his crisis. The leather felt worn, like a memory handled too often. He did not open it. For once, he did not seek answers in words. He simply breathed. One breath, another. Slow. Settling. Human. The night outside pressed gently against the walls, a soft creature made of wind and waiting. He whispered into the stillness, "I don't know what comes next." The silence received his confession with the patient modesty of someone who already knew. He leaned back, letting his head rest against the cold stone. That ancient surface that had listened to centuries of monks searching for something nameless. He wondered how many of them had doubted, how many had cried quietly at night, how many had whispered prayers that felt more like question marks than sentences. He suspected the number was higher than the monastery chronicles suggested. Most spiritual stories prefer to skip the parts where the soul trips over its own feet. He closed his eyes, exhaled, felt the room sway gently as if rocking him into a softer way of being. Tonight, his thoughts did not spiral. Tonight, he did not chase signs or question the universe or search for meaning in every flicker of candle flame. Tonight, he simply existed. That, he realized, felt strangely like faith. Not the loud kind. Not the confident kind. Not the kind that promises answers, but the kind that breathes quietly in the dark, unnoticed, unpolished, undaunted. He opened his eyes again to find the candle nearing its end, the flame shrinking into a thin thread of light. It wavered, swayed, struggled, and in its struggle, Aurelius saw something painfully familiar. He reached out with a gentle finger and shielded it from the draft. Not because he needed the candle, not because it held divine secrets, not because he feared the dark, but because he finally understood. Some lights are worth protecting, even when they burn imperfectly, especially when they burn imperfectly. The flame steadied, just slightly. Enough. He whispered, "Thank you," to the candle, to the silence, to the ambiguous presence that may or may not have been listening. He rose slowly, letting his joints protest in the holy language of the aging. He walked to the window and pushed it open. The night greeted him with a cool breath, soft and serious. The stars hung above like small, patient eyes, not watching, not judging, simply existing in the same mystery he did. He looked up, not for signs, not for answers, just to look. "How strange," he murmured, "that the world continues even when I don't understand it." The wind rustled the leaves in vague agreement or polite disagreement or indifference. It was hard to tell. He closed the window, turned to the table, and extinguished the candle with a gentle blow. Smoke curled upward, twisting like a final thought escaping from a sleeping mind. The room darkened, but did not feel empty. Not tonight. Aurelius lay down on his bed, pulled the thin blanket over his chest, and let the darkness settle around him like a slow, familiar tide. He did not pray. He did not doubt. He did not search. He simply whispered into the darkness, "I will listen, even if I never hear." And the darkness, faithful in its ambiguity, wrapped itself around him like a quiet promise that uncertainty is not the enemy of the soul, but its inevitable companion. He closed his eyes. The monastery slept. The world breathed. The silence held its vigil. And somewhere, far above, far within or far beyond, a divine presence might have smiled, or might have been busy, or might have been politely ignoring messages, as everyone does on Mondays. You, listening now in your own quiet place, carry the echo of Aurelius's journey inside you, the uncertainty, the hunger, the beauty, the absurdity, the whispered why, the whispered listen, the whispered I don't know, but I'm here. Before the darkness takes you deeper into sleep, into that soft place where dreams and doubts dance together, allow me one final, ironic benediction, spoken quietly, with a candle's tenderness and a monk's tired humor. If this story kept you awake a little longer tonight, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.